Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week we bring you leading nuclear deterrence experts for a lively discussion on current topics. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Deterrence Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
Welcome back to NucleCast, and I am your host, Adam Lowther. I am very pleased to have as my guest today, Dr. Brent Park. Now, you may or may not know Dr. Park, but if you don't, he is a man with a fabulous and respected career. He is a PhD from the Ohio State University in physics. And then he went on to have a respected career at the labs, do a lot of great work, and then was it Los Alamos, was a associate director at Oak Ridge National Lab. I got that right, associate director, wasn't it? And then he went on to be the number 2 guy at National Nuclear Security Administration. And so he has now left government and is doing some consulting. And I thought we would have a chance today to do a discussion that we've never done before on NucleCast, where we talk about what it means to be a labbie and some of the challenges in culture and politics that you have to deal with. And so with that, I want to welcome in Dr. Brent Park. Brent, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you. And one minor correction. I got my PhD from Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. I'm a Bobcat. But
oh my goodness,
it's all good.
All right. Well, Ohio, you know, there would be a rivalry there.
Actually, I worked with the OSU people, and although I did my PhD work at Los Alamos National Lab, and so I'm actually glad that you're going to be asking about the national labs and how they operate. So I think many of the people who rely on national labs may not know, what it takes to operate at the, wonderful labs within DOE and whatever else you may want to know. I'm more than happy to give you my understanding. I retired from several labs before getting into the government job, and now I'm out of it. I'm more than happy to share with you my thoughts.
So let's talk about the labs, because you spent quite a bit of your career at the labs. And so most people don't really understand that the national labs, because they're national labs, are actually government owned and then corporate operated. Could you maybe give us a sense of how does that system work? Why does it work that way? Why aren't they just government entities where everybody's a government employee? Maybe describe that, explain it.
Sure. So for us to discuss the national labs within Department of Energy, we actually need to go back to the Manhattan Project days. And that's actually, that's about the time when we started thinking about what we now call national labs. And obviously, I retired from Los Alamos National Lab. I will retire shortly, but the important thing here is that the national labs are there to actually avoid SAT surprises. And I need to actually qualify all my answers. I'm going to give you a small slice of a very big picture, because there is no way we can cover what national labs do and all that within 10-minute time we may have. So important thing is I'm going to give you a small slice to give you a glimpse into how national labs operate. But back to answering your question, it's there to make sure we actually have national security solutions to improve and defend the national interests, right? That the fact that what is today's Los Alamos National Lab, for example, they worked on nuclear weapons. I mean, the first a bunch of people who went there. Everybody knows about the history with Oppenheimer from UC Berkeley. The origin is very important for national labs. Government entity back then, what we call Army Corps of Engineers, actually asked Oppenheimer to say, "Hey, why don't you pull together a team to work on this very important classified project?" So the genesis of many of the national lab system that we have is what's it called, government-owned, quote-unquote, contractor operated. much of national labs actually operate within that model of government has mission to execute, and it relies on brilliant technical staff and support personnel to actually get the job done. And to that extent, it actually is a really great model. And many other nations are trying to copy our national lab system model to actually pursue the S&T agenda for themselves. Coming back here, we have a lot of people working at 17 different national labs. Only one is government-owned, government-operated. That's metal. Everything else is a government-owned, contractor-operated. And as it turns out, the companies that are corporate sponsors for operating these national labs, they actually have to create a separate LLC to help manage the labs. And there's actually hands-off required. That LLC is there primarily for the purpose of helping to manage that laboratory. So there are rules and regulations about corporate sponsors getting into the lab business, and there's actually very stringent requirement as to what gets to operate, help to manage the labs. If you look at the national labs quickly, give or take, there are roughly about 100,000 people working in these national labs. That's PhDs, master's students, technicians, contractors supporting. And as it turns out, from A to Z, anything that is very difficult for industry, anything that is really super long-term in terms of science, that's what national labs focus on. It's not something that an industry or a company could just show up and say, I want to do this,
Sure.
Right?
A lot of basic science work.
Absolutely. Much of the classified work, including weapons research, science and engineering, all that, requires government owning and maintaining the expert, the knowledge, and that it requires government to own it. And it does require smart people to come and work with us. So it's a really good combination. I think it is where it needs to be, because it's a multi-program Department of Energy, Office of Science, NNSA. There's a nuclear energy. There's a EERE, ARPA-E. I'm using acronyms because of the short time we have, but that actually makes it really unique for these smart people to do different types of research. When you hire somebody, brilliant scientist, and say, you got to work on this project only, guess what? There is no way we can retain that person for a long term. So many of our smart people, including wonderful support staff, they get to work on many different projects for all of DOE and many other departments and agencies. And that makes actually our workforce even more engaged, even smarter, and they look at the big picture, right, for the nation. And obviously, I can go on forever, right? I'm very passionate about how national labs work, and they are doing probably the work that nobody else can do. It's the largest R&D enterprise in the whole wide world, and we need to defend it, protect it, and nurture it. We got to do everything possible to take care of these wonderful systems.
Now, as we think about the lab, you mentioned the lab system, but as we narrow that down to sort of the core labs involved in the nuclear weapons enterprise, we've got Los Alamos is our original lab that Oppenheimer started, and then out of that came Livermore and Sandia. And then we have, we've got Pantex, and we've got Kansas City National Security Complex, and it's sort of grown. Can you maybe give us an explanation of how that system works, and who does what within it?
So we have basically, again, this is a 100,000-foot view, giving you a small slice of how actually things work. We have the so-called the national security labs, like you pointed out, Los Alamos, Livermore, and Sandia, supported by plants and sites. And by the way, before we focus on those entities, there are other science labs that provide very important basic materials research that is also part of the foundation and the backbone for weapons programs. So it's actually the community as a whole that provide solutions. I will not talk about too much, but we have a lot of important partners, industry partners, that provide the people and expertise and so on. We can save that for next conversation. But going back to the community, a long time ago, we had to build something. This is in 1940s, something right away because of World War II. There were so many things happening.
Right.
There was actually race, as historians would actually tell you, to get to that first weapon system. And of course, we made a huge difference after the fact. That's how it ended the World War II. But back to the reality, this national security system went through different phases, right? Building up, and then taking things down, and then making things more safe, and so on. There are different phases over the last now almost 80 years, right? And through that, we actually evolved with the changing environment. And as the responsible nation that we are, and the world leader, every time we actually we would have a chance to make it safer and secure, we would take that step. And along the way, we actually had to separate things out a little bit and say, hey, you guys work on this topic. For example, Kansas City plant, but they would work on what we call non-nuclear components. And Sandia, you guys work on the engineering and putting the system together. And Los Alamos remained as physics lab working on what we call pits and other things and material science. Livermore does a wonderful job being a physics lab as well as engineering lab. That's my characterization, by the way. That's kind of all in one that we really love at Livermore, providing that important leadership. But coming back, there's what we call specialization. And we went through a period of not being able to do any testing since 89, 90 time frame, right? So Vic Reese, and I think most of the audience would actually recognize the gentleman's name, one of the leaders, the leader who came up with the cycle stewardship program to make sure while we're not doing testing, we can actually guarantee and ensure that our stockpile is safe and available, hoping that we would have never need to use it. And during that phase, we actually the government invested a lot of money into modeling and simulation to make sure we can actually make the system safer, more enduring, and minimize work. And there are all kinds of things that actually happen with our technical workforce. And by the way, this is important to point out. It's actually the largely weapons program that led what we now call supercomputing or HPC. Yeah. There are a lot of things, and I cannot mention everything that we have done. We call it a weapons program. In reality, this is advancing your knowledge and expertise on not only materials, computational skills, everything in between. And that's actually what came out of our national labs.
And so when the national labs work on a lot of the basic sciences and they advance, they develop supercomputing, and that's useful in a number of areas. One of the big things that's important in DoD right now is sort of this idea of spinning in technologies and spinning out technologies. So do the labs play a role in sort of either spin in or spin out of technologies with the things that they're developing?
That's actually a perfect question. I'll answer that in two different ways. One is, we cannot slow down the basic research. As soon as you do that, your seed corn is gone.
Sure.
I mean, in 5-10 years, you're going to pay the price 100 times over. So we should never entertain that notion of, we can slow down to make things more operational. Then the country will pay the price 100 times over. That's not worth anything. Number two, as it turns out, national labs as a whole, they work with other department agencies, DoD, for example. SNDI does a lot of cooperative research and operational support, and all other labs too. So oftentimes what actually happens is agencies within the DoD system, for example, would actually work with our program managers at DOE and the national labs and say, hey, we need support in this area. We need to operationalize this. We need to make this smaller, lighter, last longer, or whatever the requirements might be. And so our people who spend a lot of time doing the DOE mandated research, as well as basic research, they would actually get to apply their skill sets to actually help other departments, starting with the DOD and other agencies, right? So in addition to us, I shouldn't say us anymore because I'm out of the system, DOE researchers, technical people, turning their product into more deployable systems. They actually do support and work directly with the departments, DOD in this case, in your example, so we can help operationalize whatever that it might need for field work.
So as we think about, I've been at the STRATCOM Symposium, and we had a panel this afternoon that was a panel of mostly graduate students. And there was a couple of questions about, how can DoD encourage more interest in the nuclear enterprise, and then, sort of both, the development side and then the operation side. And so as you think about the workforce across the labs and across, NNSA as well, because you're a former senior NNSA guy, do you see a successful path? Because I think I read here recently that the average age of a labbie is over 50, 55 area. And I'm sure, I was a Fed for a long time, and the average age of a Fed was above 50. And so I'm sure NNSA has an aging workforce as well. Do you see a successful approach and path to sort of bringing in young people to replace these older folks, scientists and engineers that are leaving? And are we getting good folks doing it?
That's an excellent question, and I appreciate the interest, because that's really important. Because you cannot have a strong national lab system without great people coming in routinely, right? And I'm happy to share with you our average age. This is my understanding, as of about a year and a half ago, when I was in the government still, that has been going down steadily, which is a good thing, right? Yeah. And we've been hiring a lot of what we used to call next generation. They're coming into our system. And although, in certain areas, we still have a hard time competing with the industry partners, for example, in the computational world, because these brilliant scientists out of school, they can get a job in Silicon Valley, probably making 2-3 times as much as they would in international labs. But we are actually getting the right people. They are actually interested in learning and contributing in the national security space. And we're getting quality people. Could we get more? Of course, we could use more. But the things have changed over the last 10, 15 years or so. Ever so briefly, I was actually a PhD student at Los Alamos National Lab in the 80s. That's where I did my PhD work and became a postdoc and staff member and became a manager. As it turns out, DOE, rightly so, actually has a wonderful, outstanding relationship with the universities, hundreds of them. And for example, I can actually talk about Los Alamos, as I was briefed on their numbers before I left NNSA. And these are rough numbers. I don't remember the exact numbers. I think they actually have close to 2,000 summer students. And they have over 400 postdocs. They all come from universities.
Sure.
And the fact that they could maintain this number, and the number is comparable percentage-wise a little more. And the CNBI is a little different because it's engineering lab primarily, and many people don't go through postdoc. They became staff members right away, which is a good thing for engineers. But overall, our attraction, if you would, recruiting rate is pretty good. And talking about NNSA, again, my information is dated, about a year and a half. We actually hired a lot of people into NNSA, and many, by the way, we need the seasoned veterans, we need experts, we need mid-career managers, we need early career people, and we've been hiring left and right, up and down, and we actually have a pretty good success story, and many are from universities.
This episode of NucleCast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. So as you think about sort of the DOE enterprise, the nuclear enterprise, and then there's there's DOE, NNSA, the labs, and then over here is DOD. I mean, there's this relationship that exists between NNSA and the labs, DOD and NNSA, DOD and the labs. Do you see that relationship is working effectively, or do you have changes you would recommend? I mean, because we're really facing an international system in which we have an increasingly aggressive China, we have a very clearly belligerent Russia, and we may be called upon in the near term to build new warheads, new delivery systems, and develop capabilities rapidly, because we have one of those moments where we say, oh man, we're sort of behind. And America's pretty good at it's catching up quickly. Is that system prepared to do that?
So overall, I think we have a very reasonable, tried and proven system. And there are so many reasons why it makes sense to keep NNSA within DOE, because like we talked about, much of the basic science opportunities, much of other materials research, and there are so many things happening. Ability to work with other parts of 17 national labs is critical to maintain, because at the end, you need to protect your workforce so they can do the outstanding research and deliver on these products. And something about DoD, I actually appreciate your question and your viewing the angle about how can we better team up with the DoD for operationalizing many of the outstanding research that DOE labs have been doing since 40s. I think this is my personal thought and idea, and I would not hold anybody to it, but it might be actually interesting for DoD to officially create an entity that would actually directly work with National Lab System, rather than units under DoD going down 10 layers, and each of this office would actually call DOE headquarters and NSA or go to national labs. Coordination could be better. Not so much, you don't have to change the national lab system, but in terms of DoD leveraging, getting more out of DOE national labs, it might actually make sense for DoD to establish more of an official go-between, not to create additional barriers, by the way. Yeah. Right? Because even with good intentions, you can actually make it even worse. That's not the purpose of doing something like this, but it might actually help make a more coordinated, what I call partnership between two departments. And as much as I love supporting DoD, and I've been doing it while I was at National Labs doing research, I supported a lot of DoD units. I think it would be disastrous if you were to move a national lab, anything out of the Department of Energy today. There is more of a ripple effect, that unintended consequences that we're not prepared for. It requires much more planning, thinking, and assessing. It's not just, move this to that location. That is not I don't think they'll work.
So if I were to give you a genie, and you could rub that lamp, and you had 3 wishes, and you could make 3 wishes about the nuclear enterprise, change anything you wanted, improve anything you wanted, what would your 3 wishes be?
So it's not about just the national security labs, like Los Alamos, for example. And I know why it has to be done this way. But the fact that our national labs, including weapons labs, they have to operate 1 year at a time, is killer. It's disastrous. In other words, when you bring these thousands of technical people and say, oh, now we're going to do 1 year at a time, it changes everything, right? I mean, there is a hiccup. This is not something that we can fix, so I can talk about it right away. And, there's something called continuing resolution that affects the entire government system. Yeah. But our research organizations are at the mercy. It's one of those. I mean, Congress has to do what it has to do. I appreciate that. But when you actually engage with researchers, this many people, and when you say, okay, now we're going to chop everything up into a 12-month period, that creates all kinds of challenges. And I think it is appropriate for Congress to say, we're going to review, we're going to actually say yes or no, we're going to give you a little bit more, a little bit less. But I know we actually have a system to do this. There has to be a multi-year view. When you give a life to a new program, it's not going to go away in 2 years, typically. And so we need to plan ahead and take a look at it. And so this is something that, since I was at both at the labs and I was at the headquarters at DOE and NNSA, there's a little too much transactional oversight. And I know why it is necessary, by the way. So this is one of those, you know why you have to have it. At the same time, you need to balance it. And the balancing is done really well when you actually have the right people. And sometimes, that's not what actually happens. And oftentimes we have outstanding leaders and, whatever the structure that we have, they make it work. And once in a blue moon, things don't work out as well. And I'm not sure what the solution might be. I don't think I have, all three wishes, but I think the important thing is let's recognize what they are and who they are and what they have been doing. And these guys, they actually believe in national security mission. Without that, you cannot last even a single day working at national labs, by the way. I mean, there are so many rules and regulations. For you to lift one finger handling, for example, plutonium, oh my gosh, you know how much training you have to do? If you don't believe in the mission, you're not going to last. So all the people, every single individual we have in our national labs, and since we're talking about national security labs like weapons labs, they're my heroes, by the way.
So if we're now at the end of the show and we have a couple minutes left, if you wanted to, many of our listeners to the podcast they might be in industry, they might be military officers, that it's a broad cross section, and many may not be very familiar with the lab system and NNSA and sort of how the nuclear enterprise works. So if you were to sort of give them an elevator speech on the enterprise, and in particular the DoD element of the enterprise, what would you tell that broad cross section of Americans about the enterprise?
Yeah. So so maybe I'll give you an analogy. So if I use this analogy, which it may not be appropriate, but the DoD is more interested in driving a car, right? And using that as an example. I don't want to call it weapons. I don't want to call it this or that, but they have to have operational car. Now, how do you build it? There are industry partners, companies, and all that who will put the system together. In terms of, if I can stay within that analogy, to make the most out of that system within the car, whether it's car engine or tires or whatever it might be, system optimization, the basic science underneath that, and applied research that you have to have it. The bulk of that are being done at our national labs, number one. Number two, what's actually critical that we need to recognize is much of needed classified research have to be done within the government envelope. And that's what's being done at our national weapons labs.
All right. Well, thanks for your time here on NucleCast. And thanks to all the listeners. We hope you'll join us for the next episode. And again, I want to thank Dr. Brent Park, a senior physicist and longtime labbie who has given us a great insight into how the lab system and the DOE element of the nuclear enterprise works. So thanks for joining us today.